Well, it is now time for the France 24 debate. Today, the King of Jordan made his first visit to the West Bank in 5 years, a rare visit indeed. It comes just weeks after protests by Palestinians over new security measures at the Aqsa Mosque complex in Jerusalem. Well, those protests ended with Israel backing down on the security measures it had put in place around the mosque. The protests also drew particular attention for the fact that they were not organised by either of the main Palestinian factions, Fatah or Hamas. Instead, they were called by religious leaders at the mosque and are seen broadly as a victory for the street. Well, considering that the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians is stalled and has been for some time, could the Palestinian side be about to take a new turn with Hamas and Fatah pushed to the sidelines? What role might Jordan have in all of this and other questions? We'll be putting those to our guests from Jerusalem. We're joined by Gershon Baskin, who's chairman of the Palestine Center for Research and Information, described as a joint Israeli-Palestinian public policy think tank and do tank located in Jerusalem, also a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And in Washington, D.C., David Pollock, who is Kaufman Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and head of Project FOURQUET, whose stated aim is to generate policy ideas for promoting positive change. Hello to you as well.
Thank you.
Well, David Pollock, I'd like to come to you first. Jordan's king, we know, has offered official backing to the Palestinians today. How significant would that be at this point?
I think it's significant in the sense that it reflects the weakness of the Palestinian position and their need for new sources of outside support. The reality today is that President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is widely unpopular among his own people and is viewed as ineffective and also corrupt and subservient to Israel. And in this situation, he is almost desperate for new sources of legitimacy and some new I would say, leverage or authority in order to continue to be an important player. He was able to score a tactical victory of sorts because, as you said, the Israeli government backed down a bit on some of these security measures. But that is very, very far from reinforcing his position in a way that would make any further advances possible. So the visit by the King of Jordan to him, not to Israel, is a plus for him politically.
All right, and Gershon Baskin, coming to you, if that's a plus for Mahmoud Abbas politically, what about those street protests? They seem to really have a strong effect. They achieved their aims of getting Israel to back down somewhat, as we've said. Do they still pose a threat, in a sense, to Hamas and Fatah?
I think it's important first to point out that the visit today by King Abdullah to Ramallah to President Abbas was more of a message to the Israeli government and the Israeli people than it was a message to the Palestinian people. I concur with David that Mahmoud Abbas has very little legitimacy on the streets of Palestine. But let's not forget for a moment that Jordan is an Arab country that Israel has a peace treaty with and a very close security relationship. And yet on the issue of Al-Aqsa and what happened on what Israel calls the Temple Mount, what the Palestinians call Al-Aqsa, was a factor that will unite the people of the Arab world together, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, and other Arabs and Muslims, against any Israeli attempts to change the status quo on that holy site. And I think this is a very clear message, particularly also after the events that took place at the Israeli embassy in Amman 2 weeks ago, when an Israeli security guard shot and killed 2 Jordanians, and the scene that we saw of Prime Minister Netanyahu embracing the security guard who was returned to Israel after that event as a kind of slap in the face to King Abdullah. This was a very, very critical moment in shaking up the Israeli-Jordanian relationship, and this was the message of King Abdullah today.
Well, it does seem that there's been a lot of shaking up going on in this situation in many different aspects of it. Aside from the diplomatic relations between Jordan and Israel there, if we come back to the Palestinian sort of grassroots action, do you believe that that is something that could be repeated again, could go on to become something bigger, some kind of a third force in Palestinian political life?
It was the first time we've seen the Palestinian street actually organize and get behind a political position in a very long time. I don't think that the leadership exists, even at the grassroots level in Palestine at this time, to lead any kind of new political grassroots movement. The Palestinian people definitely want there to be new elections. They want the split between the West Bank and Gaza to end. They want to see unity amongst the Palestinian leaders, but there's a complete absence of any kind of new generation of leadership emerging at this time that could lead the streets toward a new positive agenda.
Well, David Pollock, if I come back to you, you have written recently about a recent survey that showed that Palestinians have much more moderate ideas than their leaders on short-term issues, although it can be different on the longer term and more global issues. What do you make of this disconnect, then, between the street and the leadership?
It's thank you for mentioning the survey that was analyzed in FICRA Forum, the blog that I run here at the Washington Institute. I do think that you have contradictory tendencies on the Palestinian street. On issues of political tactics, they tend to be, as a group, more moderate than their own leaders, even the so-called moderate leaders like Abbas. For example, on the issue of whether or not to resume negotiations with Israel, whether or not to consider recognizing not just a two-state solution, but recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, or at least as a state for the Jewish people, the Palestinian public is, generally speaking, more inclined to be flexible, moderate, creative, pragmatic than its own leadership. But on issues like Al-Aqsa and on issues where you have an emotional component involved, for example, on the question of violence against Israelis, then unfortunately you still see, as these surveys point out, you still see the Palestinian street being quite hardline, quite militant, more so than its official political leaders. So it's almost impossible in today's situation, I fear, to translate this difference between the street and the elite into positive political progress.
Gershon Baskin, if I come back to you on this point, we also have hanging over this the possibility of a power-sharing deal over Gaza, at least between Fatah and Hamas. This has had quite a lot of talk recently. How significant do you think that is, and how might that play into the wider peace process, and how would Israel take that?
It's not so much a power-sharing deal between Fatah and Hamas, it's more of a power-sharing deal between Hamas and a former Fatah leader, Mohammed Dahlan, who is in exile after being convicted for corruption by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. He's an arch rival of Mahmoud Abbas, and yet he's aligned himself with Abdel Fattah Sisi, President Sisi of Egypt, and other leaders in the moderate Sunni world. Dahlan is a power broker, and his relationship with Sisi is perhaps going to enable the reopening up of the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, which is a lifeline for the people, the 2 million people living in Gaza. And we might see something being played out here. But again, Sisi has promised Mahmoud Abbas that he wouldn't make a deal with Dahlan that will compromise Abbas's leadership. So there are a lot of contradictions here, and it's yet too early still to know how it's going to play out.
Now, we touched on this a little bit before, what Israel thinks of all of this, where Israel stands. There's really been no signal lately, or for quite a long time, that Israel is wanting to restart the peace process. Considering, as you said, the King of Jordan making this endorsement of Mahmoud Abbas and potentially being seen as a snub to the Israelis, do we see any possibility for the wider peace process to get back on track? Gershon Baskin, if I come back to you.
I don't see it right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu is embroiled in a lot of scandal investigations of corruption and bribe-taking and wrongdoing. He is going to appeal to his base, which is further right-wing than he is himself. And I don't think that he will be renewing any kind of negotiations with the Palestinians unless the American administration puts significant pressure on Netanyahu to do that. And we see the Trump administration embroiled in similar kinds of investigations. So I don't know if anyone has the political openness and availability to devote themselves to an Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
Indeed. Well, David Pollock, you are currently in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Washington has been such a central part of the peace process over the years. However, we saw the U.S. weighing in very late on the Aqsa Mosque issue. Do you see the Trump administration as being in a position of getting to grips with this situation currently, or is it something that you expect that they're going to be trying to keep a bit more at arm's length?
Well, I think that the Trump administration is committed to continuing its efforts to broker some kind of Palestinian-Israeli agreement, and if possible, even a broader Arab-Israeli understanding. They are going to continue. And at the same time, I think the difference that we've already seen, and we will probably see even more clearly in the near future, is that they are not shooting for what Trump used to call the ultimate real estate deal. In other words, a comprehensive Palestinian-Israeli settlement that leads sooner rather than later to the so-called two-state solution. No, instead, we're likely to see efforts to produce calming of tension, incremental, practical progress on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians, and some efforts by both sides. And I think it's very important to emphasize that the Trump administration sees the Palestinians as just as much to blame for the rise in tensions, if not more so, than the Israelis. And some efforts by both sides to take steps that would improve the atmosphere. Because most people, and I count myself among them, regretfully, but I think it's realistic to say, most people realize that an actual final status or permanent status agreement, peace between Israel and Palestine is just not in the cards in the near term.
Well, that perhaps is a debate for another day. Unfortunately, for the moment, we have run out of time. But I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us here on France 24 today. Gershon Baskin in Jerusalem and David Pollock in Washington, D.C. That wraps it up from us. Do stay tuned to France 24.